Thanks, Dom. Morning all, this is Weird Panoramic View. Welcome to the first Audit and Governance Committee. As those of you who were on the committee know from last year, know it used to be the Audit and Accounts Committee. We took the step last year to change it to the Audit and Governance Committee to really sort of show what we actually do. The accounts is a major part of the committee, but it's only it's a big part in terms of council, but it's a small part in terms of what we actually do at the committee. So it has been changed to audit and governance. I've made notes that I now can't read. I'm going to try and keep the meetings as short as possible due to people's concerns over being in an enclosed space during this time. So for future meetings, if you have any questions when you read the paperwork, please send them through in advance to yourself, Richard. And they can be circulated then to officers and we can try and get answers to people. It's what we did a couple of years ago and it sort of fell by the wayside. I think the only other notes that I have to say before we sort of start is that the statement of accounts was published on the website recently. So please take a look at them prior to sign off later this year. And as Simon will acknowledge, it's been a really good team effort, particularly due to the pandemic. So thank you to the team that's involved in that. I'm not sure what governance there is for this meeting, other than follow the arrows and wear a mask if you need to leave the room, and then follow the one way all the way around that way to come back in. So, do we have any apologies?
No apologies, thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Dom. Late items to be introduced by the Chair, there are none. Declarations of interest, anybody? No? So, minutes of the meeting held on the 24th of March. Can I ask someone from last year's committee to move them, please?
Happy to move.
Moved and seconded? Thank you very much. So, item 5, Audit and Governance Committee, outstanding resolutions, not revolutions. Richard, this is you.
Thank you, Chair. If I just take you quickly through Appendix 1 of this. On page 3 of Appendix 1, around the Coroner Service, there's been no update since the January meeting. The other item on there's a June 21 update, and I believe Councillor Willoughby is going to just update the committee on that around the assembly rooms from a meeting you went to.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. Yes, just to say that I went to a meeting sort of towards the end of April this year, just about the assembly rooms and particularly about the sort of activity, the sort of root cause activity that have been conducted by Faithful and Gould. So basically that found that there were sort of 4 delays. The first 3 of those didn't have any sort of real impact on the overall cost because they met those out of contingencies and that sort of things. So they didn't have any awareness of this until the sort of 4th delay, which remember was notified Chair in January 2020. And that's when the sort of costs significantly increased from the sort of 23 million, whatever, up to the 33 million. So they did a sort of root and branch root cause analysis just to see where the issues were, and I think it was found particularly around this sort of approach of the people who were doing the work, around their approach to feasibility and project and risk, and also their own approach to governance as well. The council sort of, was found out to be okay, so it was a root cause with the actual supplier. And I think, for my mind, although obviously it was a bad sort of embarrassment, I suppose politically for the council, actually the assurance mechanisms, which I know that we've been making sure as a committee have been put in place over the last few years, actually work to highlight the sort of ongoing unfeasibility of this project, which is why it was cancelled. So I think I was happy myself that the right assurance, which is what the key thing for our committee, is the right assurance mechanisms and sort of robustness of the root cause analysis was actually conducted. So thanks. Yeah.
Going to carry on then, Chair. Do we want that item now removing from the outstanding resolutions, as Councillor Willoughby is happy that he feels that it provides enough assurance, if the committee are happy with that?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yep. Yep.
Steve, can you turn your mic off when you finished?
Oh, sorry.
Carrying on through the appendix, a couple of the items are appearing on the agenda. So there's the Simon's assessment of the effectiveness of the system of internal audit is on later. Also, that we had the training from external audit was delivered before the March meeting, so that's all done. The other key issue I wanted to mention really from this was around the handbook. That in Appendix 2, which is the action plan arising from the committee's self-assessment that they did, well, over 12 months ago now, one of the things was that we produce a handbook. I've got the June update in here. I've been looking for a solution to host this handbook, because what I want to make is not a static document. I want to make it a living document so that members can access it, and I can put interesting information, well, what I would think is interesting information on there anyway for members to have a look at and notify you. So one of the things I'm exploring is that we can use SharePoint. Now, internal audit SharePoint page will go live on week commencing the 23rd of July. So hopefully I'll be able to have the handbook fully up and running on there for members to access, and I shall keep it fully updated with stuff from SIPFA around audit committee briefings and that type of thing. The other ongoing action on there is around the need to make members aware that this is a non-political committee, and that's down to the chair to enforce that. But that stays on there. And that's all I really wanted to say on the outstanding resolutions.
Thanks, Richard. The reminder, you should have received the reminder at training that this committee is apolitical. The previous chair did a cracking job of shutting down any political speech over the last 3 years, and I will continue that. Thank you. Yes, Philip.
Just on Appendix 2, the first bit about new committee members, if it would help any new committee members or any committee members who are not used to accounts and audit and working things, I'm quite happy to give any advice, help, being a non-political member of any. So if anybody has any queries or not sure about what things are, I might be able to help. I won't be able to help on IT issues like Governor Jennings, but anything to do with accounting issues. I wouldn't say I know everything, but obviously I have certain experience, and if anybody has any technical issues they want to talk through with me at any time, they can contact me through the email or phone or whatever. So I don't, in advance of meetings, or even in advance of, a meeting, just in front of a meeting. So I'm quite happy to ask as a mentor or anything else. Any help, if that would help anybody who's not too sure.
That's very helpful.
I think it's quite
thank
important
you.
that members some new members are quite reluctant to ask questions sometimes because they're going to sound a bit odd, but ask questions. If you're not sure, ask the question. Because if you don't know, you bet your bottom dollar somebody else won't know in the room. Anyway, that's just my opinion. But I can help if anybody needs it.
That's much appreciated, Phil. Following on from that, I suppose is a good time to say that there will be training throughout the year on a number of topics. What we've discussed between myself and the Vice Chair is to look at having those training sessions the week before the committee meeting. And they are usually sort of 30 to 60 minute training sessions, usually much nearer 30, but just on sort of the items that are going to be coming up in the near future. They are really helpful. As Phil says, ask questions, because we've all been there that this is our first meeting and we've all sat there with not a clue of what's going on, particularly if, like me, you join the committee partway through the year. Not helpful. So yeah, please do ask. And if you have any questions outside the meeting, then I will nominate Richard as a superb person to contact. Item 6. Richard, is you again.
Thank you, Chair. Each year we put together a work programme for the committee, and this year I've put together based pretty much on previous years, but what I understand will be the best method of tackling things, certainly in relation to when the accounts will come. So at the moment it's draft, but it's up for discussion between members if you feel that the balance of meetings isn't quite correct. What I've tried to do is schedule things based on what I feel would be the officers who are reporting these things there, how they want to report them, i.e. if there's a quarter gone by, they'll want to report it following the quarter rather than in between the quarters. And also one of the tricky ones is waivers, where we have in the past overdone waivers and had too many regular reports. We've tried to cut that back, but it's at what point you want to receive waivers. I've tried to get it in at half-yearly points in the programme. But as it stands at the moment, it's draft for members to discuss, and then we can amend it accordingly.
Thanks, Richard. So, members, I suppose particularly members who were on the committee last year who have an idea of what they expect to see. Any comments on the draft work programme? Councillor Willoughby.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think the only thing which will obviously look to your judgment around sort of what puts in, because obviously there looks more agenda items on some than others, and I guess you're judging how long they take and what the report is likely to be. I know you and I had a discussion outside of it. The only thing you could potentially move is our terms of reference, but maybe we might want to get those in anyway quite soon to be updated, because we haven't updated them for the last few years. So I think, I think our key thing as a committee is to make sure we cover everything that we're supposed to. Obviously leave your sort of judgment to sort of spread it across the year, as it were.
Thanks.
Chair,
Yep.
how do you want to deal with the terms of reference? In the past, we've had a little working group that have worked on those and then brought it back to the main committee. How do you want to proceed with it this year?
I think that's worked well in the past, and I think it would be a good thing to do this year. I mean, what we've done, for those who aren't aware, is we had 3 members, didn't we? And we had a member from each of the 3 main parties look at the terms of reference. I'd be very happy to do that again, and it might be good for some of the newer members to be involved, but it would be good to have a fresh pair of eyes look at those terms and see if there's anything that we think is missing. But obviously I wouldn't want to deny anybody the pleasure of being on the working group.
Chair, I think Philip was also involved last time as an independent member. It's always useful having an independent member on there as well.
Okay, so any volunteers to look at the terms of reference with a view
Cheers,
to...
Richard.
You don't have to do it again, Phil, it's fine. And with a view to bringing them back earlier than the November meeting.
You won, Richard.
Philip keeps talking, so I think he's nominating himself. I would very much like a volunteer from each group, if possible. I will absolutely do it from mine. Councillor Willoughby is
As
indicating...
Vice Chair, I'll do the Lib Dems, if you like.
Thank you. If somebody from the Conservative group could let Richard know who will be attending from their group, that would be super. Phil, are you happy to be involved again? And Paul?
Yes, I should be involved.
Super, thank you. And thank you, Councillor Grimmadell, much appreciated. Any other comments on the draft work programme? Phil?
Just on the final accounts, will the programme for the final accounts will be okay for the 29th of September to be? That will fit in with the work programme of the external audit and everything else, will it? I mean, and what's happening to... So Helen will be able to sign it off, will you?
The audit has started as of this Monday. Signing it off will be dependent on all the component parts of the audit, including things like pension fund and whatever being received in time. But we are working with Ernst & Young to have the substantive, if not the complete audit programme scheduled for by early September. So it will depend very much on how that goes, and secondly, the external dependencies like pensions, which we know have got him a way of receiving and signing them off at the end of September, as would be our normal want.
I was just conscious that last year there was a long delay because of external effects, things to do with the pension fund and various things like that, which meant that the accounts weren't signed off until, what was it, March, or whenever it was. And obviously, if Helen is going to move on to other things, it will cause another issue, because if another partner has to come in and review the thing all over again, you know, it's causes even further delay. So I was just conscious that having had the problems last year, effectively at the end, some of which were outside of our control, outside of the authority's control, we need to ensure that everything is done as soon as possible, not just internally but externally as well, that the county can pull out the fingers on the pension fund or whatever. That was all. That was my main concern, that we didn't want extended delay like we had last year.
Thank you, Chair. As Philip is aware, there's a huge amount of regulation and audit standards to be met. We had our pre-audit meeting with Ernst & Young, which is trying to schedule the audit to all things being aligned, hit our indicative deadline of September, but neither Helen from EY or myself will give an absolute assurance on that, because it depends on issues found in the audit, any regulation standards that will change, and especially, as you've highlighted, dependency on third-party information, which, to be honest, the main delay last year from third-party information was the pension fund audit that wasn't received for Ernst & Young to use it for their assurance purposes until November, December.
Can I suggest then, Simon and Helen, that if you're able, if you're aware that there might be any sort of delays, that you let me know at some point, just so we can report back to committee. I know, like you say, things will be out of your control, and we know that from last year, but if you are aware of anything, that would be useful to flag up. So I take it the committee is happy with the draft work programme, with the exception of the terms of reference review, which we can look to add in once the working party has met and reconsidered terms. Super. Item 7, external audit, is Simon.
Whoops. Just find the right page, as always. Okay, so just to highlight, and then Helen will be taking us through this, is that members will recall there's a timeline of information, audit plan, ISA 260, which is a finding of the audit, the annual audit letter, and other reports that are detailed in the original audit plan. Inevitably, because of the issues with signing off the accounts, this is slightly later than normal and has to follow the sort of the signing off of the accounts. In here, there's a lot of detail that Helen will take you through in respect of it, most of which previous members of the committee will have heard already. And at the end, she'll bring our attention to anything that she feels that we need to either consider as we start planning for next year, and or the fee levels that may be generated from it. But if, with your permission, Chair, I'll hand over to Helen Henshaw from Ernst & Young.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Chair. Morning, everybody. So Simon points out the annual audit letter is a document that external auditors are required to prepare at the closure of the audit, so after the audit opinion has already been issued. Those members who were also members of the committee last year will have already received from colleagues of mine the audit results report back at the autumn of last year, which at that time the audit had two primary areas which remained still to be completed, which was, as has already been discussed, the audit of the pension balances, because information was outstanding from the Derbyshire scheme, and also the final considerations with regards to going concern of the authority, which needs to be considered at the point the accounts are signed, because that's a look forward view for 12 months thereafter. The annual audit letter that's in the papers today therefore summarises the information that was already communicated to the committee back in autumn, plus those final close-out of matters on the pensions and the going concerns. Now, just so that everyone's aware, as a matter of process, the Audit Committee delegated responsibility to the Chair for signing off those final parts of the accounts in conjunction with Simon in the Section 151 role. In order to ensure the Chair was fully informed of how those matters had closed off before the accounts were signed, a letter was written for the Chair via Simon to close those matters off. So these things have been communicated with the committee prior to appearing in the annual audit letter. Given that the annual audit letter is so backwards focusing and is primarily talking now about, a financial year that was well over 12 months ago, I'm not going to go through it in great amounts of detail because it's probably of lesser relevance. I will just point out to you the areas which we considered in the audit to be of more significant risk and how those matters were concluded in the end. And that's important, I think, because typically those areas of significant risk remain pretty static year on year. So that will give you a sort of a heads up, if you like, as to what will be the focus for the 2021 audit, which is has started this week, and which you'll see in our audit plan, which will get presented at the next committee meeting. So on page 11 of our report, we talk about misstatements due to fraud and error, which sounds, if you're not familiar with a term like that, quite severe. That's an audit risk which is identified on every audit that's performed up and down the country, and it's effectively talking about the risk that management are in a position where they could override internal controls regardless of how good those internal controls are. And so therefore the audit needs to perform procedures to attempt to identify whether that has in fact happened. And as you can see in the report, we didn't identify any instances of management overriding controls. The second risk on page 12 of the report talks about the risk of fraud in revenue and expenditure recognition. And again, that word of fraud can be quite emotive. Really what this risk is talking about, and again, it's a risk that has to be considered on every audit, is whether revenue and expenditure have been recorded in the correct financial year and in the correct way, or have they been manipulated in some way in order to produce an outturn or a result for the council for the year, which is what was required by management or what worked in order to show adherence to budget or whatever it might be. That's effectively what that risk is trying to get at. And as you can see from the results, there were no particular indicators that there had been any transactions posted which would allow us, or which would lead us to think that management had manipulated revenue or expenditure in that way. However, there were a couple of relatively minor issues that were noted with regards to classification, mostly of transactions. The other area of significant risk that we identify at the council is the valuation of land and buildings. And that's for a couple of reasons, really. One is the sheer scale of the valuation of the properties on the balance sheet. The number is enormous. And whilst often people may think that the assets are the assets, and if you are familiar with the way that accounting for assets in the public sector works, actually a lot of those transactions don't even hit your income and expenditure statement, so have no relevance whatsoever for your budget outturn. However, clearly the assets hold value, and council taxpayers are probably interested in whether the asset portfolio is being managed well, and that money is tied up well in terms of usage, etc. For the City of Derby. So that area is a significant risk, and we engaged specialists to look at a sample of assets to ensure that we were happy with the valuation around those, and the report just details the results of that work. Particular focus was put on the silk mill due to the enhancements that you're all aware of in terms of the work being done on the museum. Of lesser risk, but still a focus, and in this case a delay to reporting, was the pension liability valuation. So for those of you who are new to the committee and perhaps not familiar, local government operates a scheme whereby employees of the council are effectively admitted to a scheme run by Derbyshire County Council, and it's what's termed a multi-employer scheme. So all the councils in the county, their employees are members of Derbyshire County Council pension scheme. That scheme is effectively, if you imagine it as a huge pot, That pot is valued at the end of the year, and sections of it are apportioned off. So some of it relates to Derby City, some will relate to Erewash, etc. in the county. It's the way that balance is audited is that the auditor of the Derbyshire scheme audits fully the pension fund in its totality and reports back to the individual auditors of those bodies that are admitted up into the scheme any findings that they might have. Last year, partly due to COVID, because of the impact that had on asset valuations, etc., the audit of most pension schemes across the country was delayed. That meant a knock-on effect for the people who were myself and my colleagues who were sitting waiting for that information in order to be able to pass a view on Derby City Council. Because of that process I've just described, it also means that Simon and his team, when preparing the accounts, prepare the accounts with regards to pension in good faith based on the information they have at the time. It's not unusual that subsequent to that, errors get identified or issues become identified within the pension fund itself, which end up having a knock-on effect at the individual councils that are relying on it. We then end up in a situation where we're telling Simon and the team, actually, those assets that were booked, they had an error in them. You didn't know at the time, but this is the effect for Derby City Council. And that's effectively what happened and what played out this year. So there were some matters reported which ended up meaning that within the Derby City Council accounts, there was just over a £1 million overstatement to the pension fund liability. That wasn't material, and so we agreed with Simon and the team that wouldn't be adjusted in the final statement of accounts. And as I hope I've explained, it's no reflection on the quality of the information that was put forward at this time for audit. It's just a consequence of the way that these things work and the fact that Derby is part of a multi-employer scheme. The other issues that we look at are the PFI scheme and the accounting, or the schemes rather, and the accounting for that in the financial statements, and we didn't identify any issues with that. We also looked at the accounting for the Sinfin waste plant, and I'm sure everybody is very familiar with the issues around the Sinfin waste plant, which we looked at from both the accounting point of view and also from a value for money consideration. And that is something that we will continue to keep an eye on through the current year's audit as well. With respect to grant income, we did test the income that was received in addition in the latter part of the year with regards to COVID-19, and we didn't identify any issues. Just going forward to the current year audit, that will continue to be an area that we will focus on, because obviously the quantity and the different types of COVID grant has certainly increased through the 2021 financial year. Going concern, I've mentioned before. Many people might shake their head at me and say, why on earth are you worrying about going concern at a council, Helen, because that's ridiculous. And I don't disagree to some extent. However, when you as a committee approve the account, you are effectively approving the fact that you believe that the council has the resources available to it to operate for the next 12 months from the point of signing. So that is a responsibility that you're taking on at that point in time. And that's important to ensure that from a cash flow perspective, you can safely make that assertion, and also from the underlying reserves of the council that you're safe to make that assertion. So it's not about saying that the services will discontinue in the next 12 months. It's more about being alert to whether there are any concerns that may materialise in the 12 months, and whether the reader of the financial statements ought to be alerted to that in some way, or whether that the accounts have been silent on that matter and therefore could be perceived as being misleading to the reader of the accounts to gain a full picture. The only other part of the report I was going to touch on was the very final page, which Simon briefly mentioned in terms of fees. So this is the only new information for the committee, and that's on page 30 of the report. Now, I'm sure for those of you who've been members of the committee previously, you will understand how the external audit fee works in local authorities, but for those new members, it might just be worth me explaining that briefly. So Derby City Council have partaken in a national arrangement with an organisation called Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, who are effectively a collective purchasing body, and they purchase the external audit service on behalf of the councils that have signed up to that arrangement, and in doing so obviously strive to get the best price possible. So the contract that my firm, Ernst & Young, has for the audit of Derby City Council is actually with this organisation, Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, and it's that organisation that sets the fee, which is called the scale fee, and it's published on the internet, and people can see that for an organisation. Currently, in the market, there is a huge debate over the sustainability of those scale fees set by the organisation PSAA, or Public Sector Audit Appointments. And there is discussion as to whether they need to rise to keep pace with the increasing cost of external audit driven by regulation, complexity in organisations and various other things. That's a very live debate, and for those of you who read the financial press, you've probably heard wind of that. This table that I've put on page 30 of the report attempts to sort of address that issue. So it informs you of what the scale fee for the council's audit is, which is the 109,766. It then attempts to explain to you how much more that scale fee, in our view as a firm, needs to be in order for it to be sustainable to audit an organisation the size of Derby, with the group structure and the risks and complexities within it and the additional regulatory pressure, in order for that to be sustainable going forward. And that's the 108,869 that sits below it. That is not an amount which Derby City Council will be paying this year unless public sector audit appointments decide to make a rebasing, if you like, of the scale fee, and that is entirely within their hands. It's worth pointing out that Simon, as a Section 151 officer, does not agree with that amount, and has fed that message back to the PSAA, and I have also fed that message back to the PSAA on his behalf. The second amount beneath that on the table of the 64,813, that's my approximation of the additional costs over and above the scale fee, so the 109, which PSAA have set and do agree with. They're the additional costs that I have articulated as being incurred in delivering the 1920 audit over and above what would have been envisaged when that scale fee was set. So they are things specific to that particular financial year, which have incurred extra audit time and effort and cost, and that's broken down in more detail in the sort of shaded grey table that sits to the bottom left of that page. That table has been discussed with Simon and the team in detail, and while some elements of that table are agreed, others are not, and as is the mechanism under the contract, that has been put forward to PSAA, clearly articulating which elements are agreed by the council and which aren't, and that will be for their determination. And at that point, I will stop and take questions, Chair.
Thanks very much, Helen. Councillor Willoughby's already indicated, and then Councillor Kerr.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's more on this fees that's just been referred to, because why sort of, I want to explore it a bit more, why it has gone up sort of so significantly, because certainly, you know, yourself, Chair, and me, you know, sort of different roles, obviously, opposite roles last year, we're given assurances that actually, you know, all the stuff was available by the Section 151 officer, and they presented all the evidence, and indeed, this committee signed off the accounts, approved the accounts sort of in the November meeting last year, and that's after we delayed it from September, actually, because we weren't happy, but we were happy in November, but then I think we were only allowed to sign it off, you know, finally sort of during April time, and there was all this delay. So it seems that to me, and I value any extra contribution from, you know, Simon as Section 151 officer for this, is that the sort of delay or any extra work was down to the the accountants, really, the external auditors, rather than anything this council had actually done. So sort of why should we have to, you know, the classic thing, I suppose, commercially, why should we have to, the council have to sort of pay for that activity? So I think, and it was also just concerned about some general, that we've raised previous meetings as a committee, about some general performance, particularly the last one, some general sort of performance aspects of the external auditors as well. So maybe if Simon wants to respond, and maybe then we'll hear from Helen as well.
Thanks, Steve. Can I just check, Councillor Kerr, is your questions relating to the fees as well? Or?
It was, and I was going to thank Helen very much for the explanation you've given. I was more wanting to look ahead and say, you know, what is the likelihood that we're going to be asked, whether we choose to give or not, additional fees for the current audit work that you're starting, and for the completion of that. Are we going to be going through a similar scenario? And are there any ways to avoid this, really?
If I go first, I think there's a consensus in local government that when the previous contract by PSSSA, the appointing body, went out, that the value awarded to local authority audits, and I suppose by implication what was tendered and what was bid for, is unsustainable. The regulatory requirements of the FRC and everything else are quite onerous, and some of those translate from the private sector into the public sector. So we are recently being asked about our approach to the next round, which I think is 2024 onwards, in respect of that. I think, like Councillor Kerr, I think Helen did explain that really well. There's an honesty about that sustainability, and maybe what members won't recall is that out of the 64,000 of the additional fees, at the beginning of the year, I approved 28,000 because it was in relation to a series of activity, whether it be going concern, SINFIN accounting disclosures and everything else, that it was reasonable that, following the risk identification, that extra work should be done both to give ourselves assurance and also external audit assurance. In the table that is on, I think it's page 30, out of the 64,000, we've increased our agreed position to 32,000. So there's 32,000 which we do disagree with. Some of that is in relation to differences of opinion about the impact of being able to do audit sampling and information provided. Some of that is in respect of, for example, the accounting treatment of the silk mill, which remained as we declared in our accounting policies, and we didn't feel was work that was either required or the amount of work attached to it. But I'm not denying that Ernst & Young maybe spent the time on it. That's not what I'm saying here. But part of that is last year was a very complex year. Helen's talked about going concern, and having to look at going concern, which for all councils in COVID, if you remember, was a concern about how many councils were going to enter Section 114 territory and everything else. I do feel that there was extra work required, not just because of the timing of when the accounts were signed off, but in the original judgment that we again agreed a sum for. So just to maybe summarise, at the moment, Ernst & Young have declared what they think is a sustainable audit, that if PSSA say nationally across the body, the standard fee level needs to be reviewed. We are buying into that contract and we need to have a look at, but locally we are 64,000 additional fees, we've agreed 32, which means 32 will be arbitrated on by PSSA with information provided by myself and Helen. But inevitably in this world we will always have disputes between auditor who has regulatory standards and myself who have the professional obligation to produce the accounts, and it's having a mature discussion around that at the right time. And there was a small hiatus obviously with Helen coming into the audit, which meant that we had to rebase some of that, but again, to reassure members, that change in the audit sign-off director in terms of Helen is not factored into this cost. So with your permission, I was going to ask Helen if she wants to add anything to that.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Chair. Just taking Councillor Willoughby's concern first, and then I'll come on to the point that you asked. You're right, there was a delay on the part of Ernst & Young with myself taking over when Steve became ill. I can assure the committee that the costs incurred in requiring myself to go back through the audit file to be in a position to be able to sign in my own name those accounts was not transferred to the council. That's a cost that's borne by Ernst & Young, and I think I've been quite upfront with Simon and the team in terms of making sure that none of those costs were included in these estimates. If I move now on to Councillor Kerr's questions, which I think were mostly in two-part, will we be in a similar scenario for the 2021 audit? In terms of is there the facility for, or the possibility under the contract to be having a discussion at the end of the 2021 audit for scale fee variations, then yes, because that is the way that the contract is designed to work. As Simon alluded to, the best way to manage that is for myself and Simon to keep talking about this situation as the audit progresses. When the audit plan is sent to Simon in the next couple of weeks for the 2021 audit, it will set out those areas which, as at now, I foresee there might be a scale fee variation impact. So, for example, the value for money arrangements within the code that auditors need to apply for the 2021 year has been completely reworked and is a scope change in respect of the way that the scale fees are set up. So I'll be looking to have a conversation as to what did we used to do, what do we now have to do, and what implication is that for the fee. So it'll be those sorts of discussions that we'll have early on, so you can expect to see in the plan some sort of indication as to where those conversations have got to. If that then changes by the time the audit is wrapped up, that will be because either particular issues have evolved during the audit and if they've meant that extra audit focus needs to be put on a particular issue to resolve it. In the most part, I think that's really the only cause. So that there is the possibility for this, a similar scenario in terms of additional fee to be requested, but I would hope that because there hopefully won't be any transfer of responsibility on our part like there was last year, that will be more smooth. Your second part of the question was ways to avoid this, and I've probably wrapped that up in the first answer, which is I think the main way to avoid it is to be very clear up front as to what the audit requirements are, and then have a discussion with the council about how most efficiently to get to that end, because as Simon points out, and I have great sympathy on occasion with Section 151 officers, the audit regulations are ever increasing, and there is no opportunity for me to take a judgment and say I don't think I really need to do that. Unfortunately, that option is not there. Okay.
Philip.
Just on linked to the fee issue and the delays last year, we wrote, I assume we did write to the PSAA and NAO expressing our concern about the delays and the fees. Was there any sort of substantial response received from them, or was it just an acknowledgement response from them?
I think, as I probably explained to the committee, we tend to do that through the PSSA stakeholder engagement group, which I know Councillor Willoughby has been to a number of their events and everything else, because what we were experiencing, apart from a local resourcing issue that EY had around the late autumn, was being experienced nationally, and there was a very strong voice, both from the audit firms but also from local government, about that sustainability. So we didn't get a specific response, but the messaging is heard very loud and clear in both of those contracting and regulatory bodies.
The position, as I understand it, across the country is that the whole audit fee basis is unsustainable for the future, as I understand it, in a large number of authorities throughout the country. And quite clearly, the whole basis of the retendering, when it comes round again, which is happening over the next couple of years, I think, is going to have to change. Just as observation, maybe KPMG got it right when they overbidded and didn't get any work. But
Any other comments from members?
just on the actual document itself, the PFI stuff, concerns been expressed in professional things about PFI schemes coming to an end, or in the last 5-6 years, and the lack of information that authorities have on the PFI scheme, because when it was set up in the first place, everybody who set it up has gone. And unless you have the asset is in a reasonable condition, you know, you could end up with an asset which is not sustainable for going forwards. I wonder if we're some way away from, I think, any of these coming to an end, but it's essential that that the organisation has all the information to back up those PFI schemes. I'm not saying it's an issue for external audit, but I don't know if it's anything they look at, but it's something that we need to ensure is in there. That's just the one thing. On the pension liability issue, I mean, that's just an issue that will crop over every year. There's always going to be a difference in the pension fund one way or another one. We seem to have benefited, inverted commas, in that we've over-provided. So that will be taken account, presumably, as part of the close down for 2021 accounts. Yeah, that was just an observation, really, I think. Thank you.
Simon.
Just very briefly, Chair. The accounts detail the PFI schemes we got. We got 2 PFI schemes based around schools, one being the BSF programme and I think one being group schools previously, one based around housing provision, and then street lighting. Members who were here last year will know that we did a performance review in respect of our street lighting PFI with Balfour Beatty. We also rebased that and also got compensation payments in respect of the street lighting PFI. Housing, by its implication, tends to be invested over the stock. I think we have to be very aware that school PFIs, whether it be through our original programme or the Building Schools for Future, had obligations about handing back assets in the right conditions. But I think, like many authorities, and especially now for academised and everything else, is that that level of oversight that was probably intended 10, 15 years ago, whenever the PFI scheme, is probably not as strong nationally as possible. We do have local relationships, we do have catch-up meetings, but I do concur that one of the assets of PFIs, and it's more prevalent in health than it is here, is understanding the nature of that asset that will be handed back at the end of a PFI contract, because effectively, just to help members, a PFI contract is effectively they will build and provide services and life cycle investment over a period of time, and at the end, all other things being equal, that asset comes back to whoever the contracting partner was, in this case Derby City Council. So it's something we're aware of. We've got a PFI reserve of about 28 million, which is about balancing the unitary payments out and the revenue inflows in. And we're constantly looking at it and taking professional advice as required. But as Helen probably would say, is the regulation about PFIs and the changes of that over years on balance sheet, on off balance sheet, what you are required to evidence, so it's quite onerous. And I think that misses a point about, will we get an asset at the end which is fit for purpose?
Thank you. Does that answer your query, Phil? Does that answer your query? Super. Any other questions? No. Okay. Thank you, both. So item 8 is the Audit and Accounts Committee Annual Report 2020-21. And to present that is last year's Chair, Councillor Willoughby.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. This is just really, I suppose, particularly for focused at members of the committee from last year who will remember, who can just give any feedback on anything they think we've missed out. I mean, I know we certainly looked for it, and I don't think we have, but if there's anything we've forgotten, then just let us know. But I would suggest for new members, it's a good thing to item to read through, just to give you an idea of the sort of things that this committee do and discuss as well. So I think we'll just wait for just leave it open to any feedback on things we've missed, Chair. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Willoughby. Phil.
I just wondered if I've somehow upset Councillor Willoughby. Everybody gets a mention apart from the independent members and the introduction. If I have, I apologise, Councillor Willoughby.
Maybe you could add that in, Richard. We'll let you into a secret. Richard sort of wrote it, but yes, sorry we omitted you. We can just add you in.
You did feature in the point 2 information about the committee. Independent members were listed in there.
Not a bit at the beginning, you see.
No, I know. I knew I'd seen your name somewhere, so I was aghast then that you'd been missed out. But yeah, I think it is important to highlight how important our independent members' contributions are Richard, so if we could add that. Previous year's committee members, anything that you think has been missed out? Councillor Kerr?
I thought this was a good reminder about all the things that we were doing, but it's one thing that struck me was that at the beginning it said the committee is scheduled to hold at least 3 meetings each year, and then at the end we have the appendix which says that we are, it doesn't use quite the same words, but we're expected to have 4 meetings a year, and I just thought the wording might have been slightly more flexible at the beginning, so you would say, you know, this year we intended to have 5. And it then wouldn't appear to be a clash of information about the two. But otherwise, just a useful way of recalling what had gone on. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Kerr. We will look at that. I mean, the bit that I've got on my screen at the minute says it's scheduled to hold at least 5 meetings, and we held 5 meetings, but I appreciate throughout the report it might differ. The one thing that I would add from that is Table 1 from the meetings and attendance. I know that we had our last year's meetings all on Skype, but the attendance was really good, and it was fantastic to see that for one meeting we had a full complement of all 9 councillors and both independent members. I appreciate that holding them online made it more or just easier, I suppose, for the other independent member to attend. But yeah, committee members, if we can try and keep that up for this year, that would be much appreciated, and we'll see what we can do to try and make things easier for the other independent member to attend. Anything else that's glaringly obvious as being missed from former committee members? Nothing. I think Steve and Richard have done a fantastic job in preparing it. As then, per the recommendations, committee reviews the content of the draft annual report and, subject to any revisions which have been noted, approve that the current Vice Chair of Committee presents the annual report to full Council. All those in favour of those recommendations? Super, thank you. So, on to item 9, Internal Audit Annual Report 2021 and Head of Internal Audit Opinion. That will be you again, Richard.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to, for the benefit of new members as well, if I just delve into why we have this report coming here when it's really sort of a rehash of all of the progress reports that have come through to committee over the last 12 months. One of the things that internal audit has to conform with is something called the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards, which I will be highlighting for members within the handbook that's being produced. Standard 2450 requires that I provide an overall opinion. This is my professional judgment based on the results of a number of individual assignments and other activities for a specific time interval that the internal audit team has done. It can either be a rating or a conclusion or another description which addresses the overall adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's governance, risk management and control processes. This opinion can then be used by the Council to inform its annual governance statement, which will come to this committee in due course. The public sector requirement, which is set by the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, is that the opinion is presented as part of an annual report. So this is why you get an annual report with my opinion in it. The annual report needs to contain the supporting evidence, i.e. the body of audit work undertaken to support the overall opinion. So that's why I don't like to use the word, but we regurgitate all the details that have come through to you around the assurance ratings of individual audits, etc. There will be audits that weren't completed at the end of March when the last progress report came through to this committee. So that will have really reflected up to February 21. And so I do take into account any additional work that my team has done on audits in March and also flowing into April as well, where those audits relate to the 2021 audit year. My opinion also reflects other assurances, again, that are brought to this committee, such as risk assurances that you get brought through to you around risk management framework and that type of thing, and also the information governance updates that you get, which pick up on data breaches. So all of those feed into my opinion. So where there are issues being highlighted, certainly with information governance, then that does have an impact on the opinion that I produce. It's also formed by other known issues, for example, developments around project management, which again, committee have had items brought to them in the past. So again, although there are issues outside of our actual audit work, sometimes there are still issues that are being brought to this committee. One thing I'll also say is the annual report must also include a statement on conformance with the public sector internal audit standards, hence why you have a few bits on how there's a few paragraphs in there around our conformance. And we had an external assessment back in 2017. The next one's due the end of next year, I believe. Again, that's something we'll bring to committee and talk about. We also have to present the results of the Quality Assurance and Improvement Programme, which is that very interesting document that you'll find at the back of the annual report. Again, these relate to the whole of CMAP, so across all the partnerships, but we still report it through to individual committees, and it's there. And it may be something that the committee want to consider in the future, whether you want updates on this, but I know Chair and Vice Chair, we've spoken about this, and it's something we can talk about in a few minutes. Just to finish off, my overall opinion, my professional opinion, was that there is adequate system of governance, risk and internal control, but I do have some reservations around, so I can't give a satisfactory one. There are issues, as I've just hinted at, around information governance, around project management and that type of thing. Plus, we've had a number of audits that are limited, which reflect that, the risks aren't being mitigated as auditors we would like to see them. And there are still issues around not everyone buying into the audit process. I know as a committee you've requested people to attend before to talk about how they are proceeding with responding to audit reports, and that it's getting a lot better. Simon and I have had a few chats about it, and it's one of the things that Simon was looking for audit to improve on is around the escalation process if we don't get responses. I think we have been a bit too generous in the past, and that's something that we're looking to, and what we will do is bring that to committee and tell you how we're doing with all that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Richard. I will just stress, particularly for new members, that internal audit will be the topic of the first training session. Internal audit comes to every meeting. There's an update in some form. The document has sort of gone through a few iterations when we've made comments, but I think it's really useful because there's a lot of information in there, and it's all laid out in slightly different formats. And I think it's really useful to get a good understanding of that. So just so you're aware. Councillor Willoughby.
Obviously, as you say, Chair, there's nothing new in this that we know, because we get regular updates. It's worth pointing out to people that we get regular updates of this through the year. So it's a rehash of the overall summary of last year. Just to say, Chair, that I did do what you suggested at the start and submit a number of questions, with this marked up to Richard, which he answered, and it was more around something that he brought out in his speech just then, around the sort of overall, the sort of level of evidence that there was to impact his opinion with incomplete stuff and things like that, which he answered in a good way, and I'm sort of assured now that that was okay. But I think a couple of things that would sort of be useful to bring out, because I think that QAIP improvement plan which he starts on page 25, that looks good, and it was just as you said, how we can sort of just discuss, I suppose, how we can, if we want it, to report it back to committee. And then there was another particular comment in the corrective action plan on the last page actually, where he talks about another useful one, bearing in mind what we've just been talking about with the sort of performance of people implementing recommendations and stuff. And you did say to us privately you were concerned about the ongoing, they've done the work, but then whether it's actually systemic and it's ongoing, that implementation of those recommendations. And then that sort of metric that you report on the last page, I was just wondering whether we should consider sort of reporting a comparison of the percentage completed on time with those not as well, as a sort of, as a general sort of metric that we will get, you know, to help that what you've just been talking about, Chair. So thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to look at those and how we can produce those. What I'll do is, just for some of the new members of the committee, I have regular meetings with the Chair and Vice Chair where we discuss various audit issues and stuff like that. Again, I'll have a look at how we can best present this to you and share that with the Chair and Vice Chair and see if it meets their requirement before we bring it through to committee. If it's not quite right, we want to get it right before we bring it through to you.
Thanks, Richard. Fareed.
Thank you, Chair. Can I refer you to the last page, paragraph 417? It does worry me slightly that there are certain compartments within departments which are not as cooperative as we would expect them to be. That's being indicated in that paragraph. And I'm just wondering whether there is a mechanism in place which allows us to do something about it. And are those sections being reported to the head of the department or the students? I don't know what the mechanism is that has been set by the council. If there is one in place, that where people are not cooperating, you can trigger something to cause an alert, gives an alert out to everybody. First of all, if you could explain whether there is a mechanism, and if there is one, why isn't it being triggered?
Councillor saying, yes, there is a mechanism. What should happen is we have every draft report we send out, we follow up after 4 weeks to make sure that there's been a response to that. And then if we don't get a response to that, it's escalated then to the service director or the strategic director if it's the service director that we're dealing with. We have, and I'll hold my hands up here, we've been a bit too lenient, shall we say, in some of this respects where we've let people have too much time. So it's one of the things that Simon and I have been speaking about getting this escalation process nailed back down again and not being as nice to people as, you know, auditors always are. One of the things we do though is to bring stuff through to audit committee, and I certainly in the meetings I have with the chair and vice chair, I discuss areas where we are struggling, and in the past they've invited the relevant head of service or service manager along to the meeting to discuss with the committee why they haven't responded to these. But yeah, the assurance I can give you now is that we are going to make this escalation process more rigid than it has been in the past.
Thanks, Richard. Yes, the invitation to attend committee seems to work and get things done, which is marvellous. Councillor Kerr.
I'm on a similar theme, but I wanted to contrast the areas where we've got people who have wanted to engage, which I believe includes parking services, which didn't get a particularly good bill of health, but have recognised the value of having an outside pair of eyes coming in and seeing what's happening, and have engaged with that, I think, actively. And those who have been reticent about that. And I wonder if we can actually somehow, within training or something else, get the people who have engaged positively to actually do the training to others who are reluctant to engage. Because I think that it can be a bit intimidating to feel that someone's coming in, and if you're an outside body, or if you're Ofsted or something, and people get really uptight about it. And I think that expectation and whose side people are on needs to be, we were on the same side, and people need to feel that, and I think that might come best from somebody who's done, and maybe we've already done this, maybe we haven't. And in a similar vein, I feel it ought to have a pronounceable way of saying the quality thingamy thing that you did at the end. I'm going to tell you what the initials are. The QAIP, the QAIP improvement plan. Within there is a comment from number 15, which talks about to support the improvement of the organisations, that's yourselves, governance framework. We should undertake consultancy work to facilitate the self-assessment of the effectiveness of audit committees at partner organisations. And that's us checking that we're okay. The other thing I'm thinking is turn that on its head, is how we, as this audit committee and audit committees in other organisations, can actually help you check that you're doing things right. Now, that might be already built into your thinking, but if not, then we are, in a way, constantly looking at you. And one of the things that I would say back to you is that in terms of staff development, okay, it's difficult in COVID times, but is there more opportunity for staff within your organisation to get to know the audit committees better?
Simon, I know you wanted to come in as well, so...
I think Councillor Kerr, as always, brings out some interesting points that assurance is not just audit, and people often view audits or inspections like Ofsted as being a done-to, establishing, if you want to call it, the weaknesses or the system issues, or sometimes celebrating success. And actually assurance is a resource manager, whether they're managing people, looked after children, placements, money, whatever the issue is that they should seek positive assurance that the system being, which controls it, and the outcome being achieved are proportionately delivered with appropriate controls to prevent risk of loss, risk of safeguarding, risk of fraud, and everything else. And I'm a great believer, and Richard and myself are doing some work internally about revisiting our assurance framework to get the language in that this is about developing your skills. And there's that expression, isn't it? If it looks like a door, it is a door, and people need to go and make sure there is the door there. Probably a bad analogy, but sort of I'm an accountant, not a lyricist. But overall, if people do positive assurance, then on an ongoing basis, audit is not a frightening experience. It's actually enriching, and I'm glad that you mentioned parking, which is an area where historically, a number of years ago, the systems in place meant that it probably got limited or sufficient audits for a number of years. But we've invested in the system, the design of the systems which pick up good practice. We've got controls in place, and the team are skilled in the application, and they are now confident about the assurance of their system so much that they can offer my permit and whatever to other councils and the systems behind it, because they feel very positive about assurance. So positive assurance is important. In terms of the exposure of the team, I think that's really important, that auditors, accountants, sometimes we come from a mould, and understanding that actually you are an auditor as part of an assurance framework, which is a part of a delivering priorities of a council, which is the democratic accountability of being the council for the city. Them coming into here and observing, coming into some of the training and giving their lived experiences, and you can say, well, from my perspective, I want that assurance. That will constantly mature our approach to audit and everything else. So I think you raised some good points, that you are now audit and governance is about doing things well, doing things in accordance with the controls which are in place. But governance is primarily delivering the council's priorities in the best way we can. So you can link those two together.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with everything that Simon says. Councillor Kerr did raise some very interesting points, and parking services is a very good example, because their attitude to internal audit has changed dramatically over the years. In fact, they come to us all the time now asking for consultancy work. They're keen for us to go in there and look. I mean, I do a lot of training, and I used to have a slide which sort of summed up the historic view of internal audit, which we were there to bayonet the wounded. And it's, and that some people still see us like that. We are, we're there to help, to be honest. What we're trying to do is look at the risks that people face, and that they've got the controls in place within their systems to help mitigate those. So we're there to help them, but too many people, not too many, a few people now still see us as there to pick fault with them. One of the things that SharePoint will help us, and certainly open up as well to the members of this committee, is that we'll be able to share our full audit reports on SharePoint. They're too bulky and too many of them to bring to committee. Some of the audit committees, as some of the members that are on, or the Council of Care, for example, on Derby Homes will see, sometimes they take the actual audit report along there if necessary. They haven't done for some time, but at some of the audit committees we go to, the actual full audit report's on there because there's only like 1 or 2 audit reports going through each quarter. For Derby City, that'd be far too many. The agenda would be, certainly if we were printing it out, it would need a few trees to do that. But hopefully, through SharePoint, we'll be able to make the reports available so you can see the positive assurance which is in the reports. Because what we tend to do is more of this is the issues we found when we report through in the progress reports. So those reports there, as members, if you want to have a look at them, will be available through SharePoint for you.
Thanks, Richard. Does that answer your questions, Lucy?
That's helpful, and I'll wait and see what comes next.
Philip?
Just a small matter of detail, Richard. On 412 of the report, you talk about achieving 84.6 of the plan with the target being 90%. Shouldn't the target be 100% to achieve the plan? I mean, if you set off with a target, with a plan, and you say, I'm not going to do 10% of it, is that not the wrong attitude to take from day one? Surely you be saying, we should achieve 100%, and then say why you don't achieve 100%. It sets off with the wrong message to your staff. It's all right to do 90% of your work, but don't worry about the other 10%. We'll lose that somewhere. But sorry, I'm being flippant, but it seems to be an attitude, a mind point of view, rather than anything else.
Empirical knowledge has always told me that very few audit sections actually hit 100%. We strive for it. If we can get over 90, it always looks better. What we're trying to do is set a realistic target. If we set 100% every time, we know we wouldn't achieve that. So, it's something that we knew we wouldn't hit 90% because of COVID, but we were trying to get as close as we possibly could to that. I take your point, Philip. We should really be setting a target of 100%. But we know from past history that roughly we quite often achieve more than 90%. But so we set ourselves a target which we think is realistically achievable.
100 is there. 100 is there. Go for it. Get your staff motivated.
I do think there could be a change of wording to make everybody happy. Councillor Kerr?
I think that's a really interesting point. Can we turn it around the other way and make sure that the audit plan actually contains 10% more work than you can actually achieve in the year?
Perhaps we can just look at the wording of that, Richard. Because it does. I completely agree with what Philip's saying, that 90% is saying that one of those audits maybe just will never happen. And that's not what we want to see. We also don't want to see people setting themselves up to fail, because that's not good for morale. But perhaps the wording of that could be changed. Any other questions on this document? No? Super. So item 10 is the review of the effectiveness of internal audit, and that's over to you again, Simon.
Okay, thank you for that, Chair. So this was a request which came out of the self-assessment questionnaire that the previous committee did, and one of the questions on there was, does the committee review the adequacy of internal audit staffing and other resources? And I was requested to undertake this assessment and report back to this committee. I think what the report does highlight is that's not a random question that we don't consider every year, but it's part of the requirements of the accounts and audit regulations, where we must undertake a relevant authority must undertake an effective internal audit to evaluate the effectiveness of risk management, control, governance processes, and taking into account public sector internal auditing standards or guidance. And it's also discharging the obligations that you can see in paragraphs 4 to, say, 4.7. Members will be aware that we have our internal audit service delivered through for Central Midlands Audit Partnership with a host body, and Richard is the Chief Internal Auditor and Audit Executive for CMAP. CMAP obviously gives us the benefit of size, and it also gives us some benefit of resilience and also sharing of audits across a number of councils. So there are a number of district councils and the fire authority who also subscribe. For structure and staffing of internal audits, we detail there the relevant skills. We're lucky at the moment to have a highly qualified internal audit section in terms of their both professional qualification and also internal audit experience. But one of the areas that we do have concern over is obviously the succession planning. As like many audit sections, the teams get older, and we need to ensure that we look at the leaders and successors of the future and make sure they're equipped with the right skills. So, for example, one of the areas of skills we've been looking at is predictive analytics, which allows us to maybe identify patterns and areas within the council that we wouldn't have previously. And in the past year, a number of people on Richard's team have been accessing predictive analytic training and working with our call-off partner KPMG in respect of some of that. So that is really positive. In terms of resourcing the plan, I think members will note that in 1920 you operated an annual audit plan which allocated approximately the 1,400 days across the year, but was set down at the beginning of the year when we'd seek permission to amend the audit plan during the year. You'll remember Richard came and asked your permission as a committee to change to a quarterly rolling audit plan, both to be responsive to the any issues raised, the assurance profile and risk assessments we undertake, but also that fundamental change that audit is there to assist the assurance framework of the council. So a term often used is business partnering. It's obviously audit has a role beyond business partnering, but understanding the organisational design, understanding the processes to achieve the objectives we want. And a lot of the audit now is focused more on embedded assurance alongside, as we, for example, introduce a project rather than a post-audit assurance, for that is still in the remit of audit to do. We're looking at the difference in the audit reports, and you'll see these coming through, between the design of the system, is it designed to operate effectively, and then the execution of the system, are people operating in the right way using the controls in place, which I think is picking up a bit of what Helen says about some of those inherent risks that we need to be considering. The audit team, as Richard indicates, reviews itself against the professional internal audit standards, and I'm happy that I have a fit for purpose internal audit section in respect of that. And in terms of, I suppose, where we want it to go, I want the profile of internal audit to be more alongside. I want responses to audits to be more timely, so any inherent weaknesses or any improvements in assurance are embedded quickly. I do think as we look forward, some of the areas are that using SharePoint, which is effectively records management and a workflow and other things embedded in that great monolith called Office 365. We need to use that to the maximum ability. We need to use dashboards which don't look like a Speedo on the audit reports, and just get a bit more of that insight into what this is saying. So that will probably lead us to less recommendations, but maybe more focused recommendations and more cross-cutting issues. For example, if we had no capacity around, say, ability to do predictive analytics, it might be identifying sort of sort of capacity to do that. And I suppose finally, it's just to place on record that the internal audit section, if you have a look at it, like most of us suddenly experienced this sort of a earth-shattering event in March 2020, and where audit is often alongside and working with people about testing evidence files and everything else. We've moved a million miles to how we get information on a portal, how we test it, how we engage, how we communicate. And I think it's credit to the audit team when you have a look at it, and I accept Philip's comment about the target, but 84.6%, and I feel when I looked at Richard's report, a significant step change in, if you want to call it, the audits undertaken, the depth and breadth of them, and the timeliness. I think actually the internal audit section did really well last year to translate, and now we're working to, well, you've experienced that, what is your lived experiences and what can we learn from it in respect of how we carry out internal audit for future. So broadly I'd say that I think that CMAP is an effective internal audit service. It has a positive direction of travel, and I look forward over the next year to working with Richard and his team to try and improve the effectiveness of internal audit as part of the assurance framework for the council. But just to record my thanks to CMAP and especially to Richard at its head for guiding us through what has been a very difficult year and giving me the assurance, because if I'm happy from what he says, that makes my life easier.
Thank you, Simon. And I think we do need to give our thanks to Richard particularly. Internal audit, I think, has been bolstered by the support from this committee over the last few years. Certainly when I was originally on the committee, internal audit was not given the dues it deserved, and Richard certainly wasn't. So I would like to see the committee continue its support for internal audit. Again, training on internal audit before the next meeting, which I think will be really useful. Councillor Kerr.
Yeah, I'm hoping that Richard was very happy with your report, Simon. And I think also it's really healthy for you also, Simon, to have identified that in that partnership there are things that the council can do to work more closely and better as well. And I think that's a really, to me, that's a really healthy appreciation, self-appreciation and relationship. So I'm really pleased with that. Just a thought, in terms of thinking about the staffing, it feels to me, and I may be wrong, that the majority of the staff have come through a fairly traditional audit route. And, you know, apart from people coming in from IT who have come in with a specific IT background, they've sort of trod an expected path. And as internal audit has moved more from looking at the numbers to looking at the organisation, I'm just wondering whether there's scope here, where capacity allows, for people to go for almost a work placement from a council or other organisation into internal audit, to bring with them a specific understanding of social care, of education, of highways, so that they are then a broader resource for internal audit. And there might even be scope for people to be doing job shares between a local authority or other organisation and internal audit. And they have a specialism that isn't related to finance or to IT, but to another aspect. And that could be a really fresh way of getting experience in. And it might also break down some of the barriers to believing that an internal auditor can come and tell you anything about your job. So just a thought that maybe could be explored.
Okay, thank you for that. And Richard will probably come on to say that he has developed IT auditors and developed the depth and breadth. But I think your point is very much, this is not audit, it's about assurance. And if you were in a private sector body, you would be looking, as I know Councillor Willoughby is a quality auditor, and the whole, we've got performance improvement officers and everything else. And all of them are about assurance, and we need to encourage that attractiveness of internal audit, which is sort of the assurance people of the council, not the internal auditors of the council. And I suppose on the flip side, and I just want to put the mirror to that, is I talked briefly in my report about embedded assurance. So previously, our auditors had no exposure to projects as they were going along, and were not giving advice necessarily at the right time, which would have benefited that project. Over the past year, I don't know the exact percentage, but probably 10% 15% plus of our work is now about embedded assurance alongside. So there's that learning going across the council, and our auditors are skilled in respect of what is good governance, what is good risk management, what is good sort of evidence base, what are good controls. And by the osmosis, I think, of us going the other way, alongside an embedded assurance, the strength of assurance across the council is getting better. And I'd believe that in 20 years' time, the majority of people who come into an audit will not be through the AAT or SIPFA route. They will be coming from other routes, and I would welcome that, because most of the audits are not financial audits. They're about governance, they're about assurance, they're about outcomes. Thank you, Chair.
Just to pick up on Councillor Kerr's comment, one of the things we are looking at, and surprisingly enough, we're actually interviewing for a trainee auditor this morning, so some of my staff are doing that. But the backgrounds of those type of people are quite interesting, and we are looking now to move away from, getting people with, finance backgrounds. I mean, if you look at most of the audit section, we have quite a few, say, SIPFA qualified accountants. SIPFA trains financial managers; it doesn't train auditors. We look at the Institute of Internal Auditors. They've never really been finance-based. They tend to train auditors around assurance, risk, governance, and so that's the route we're looking at now to train people. But we've also looking at, when we're appointing people, do we really need someone that's got, bags of audit experience, or do we need someone that we think can do the job as, say, a senior auditor, but it's got a different background? And we have, for example, we've got a senior auditor now that's got an insurance and risk management background. So he views things differently to auditors, which is great. So we have quite an interesting conversation when he produces reports as to where he's coming from on that, and it's very, very interesting. So we are moving towards that. But the good old days of ticking and bashing financial invoices and all that type of stuff is long gone, and that we need to be looking really at the bigger picture and in governance. And although we can sort of develop, from our financial manager background into these type of things, and we do want new skills coming into audit. And as Simon mentioned, when it comes to IT, what we do is we have an IT audit placement system where we go to the local universities, and where they've got people doing sandwich courses where they need 12 months in industry or something, we offer up Derby City Council, come to here and be an IT auditor. And in the past, what it's led us to is to actually take on these people. And we've got our current principal IT auditor came through this route, and he's now an expert in forensics. In fact, Derby's IT section are forever coming to him for him to do various tests for them and stuff like that, and it works well. And we're getting more collaborative with our approach as well, so we're moving away. I'm probably straying into my next report, so I'll perhaps talk to shut up, but we are getting more collaborative now as well, and working with people rather than just going in and doing plain audits.
Thank you both. Philip.
Just to correct the thing, I wasn't suggesting that they hadn't done a good job last year, Rich. I was just thinking aspirational, go for your 100%, and that was great. Just looking at the, I note that there's an external assessment due next year, November 22. It does say here that the partnership board will determine how and when it will happen. Will this committee have any input into that external assessment, this as to who does it, well, thing? That's the one question. And presumably that will then feed into the partnership agreement finishes in 2025, I've noted. Presumably your performance review of 2020-2022 will feed very much into what happens in 25. I mean, just an observation, really. But does this committee have any input into the overall review, and will it do?
Obviously, as part of that review, the chair of this committee sits on CMAP, so we'll be commissioning who that review comes from. I think it's right it's done at CMAP level rather than component councils. That review will identify not only the compliance but areas of development, and if we actually think, for example, that CMAP isn't going to have the capacity to provide that quality service in the future, I don't think that will be the case. we could decide not to renew the partnership agreement in 24, 25 or whatever date is in the report. But no, it is important, and that review will be inclusive of getting reviews from committee either through request for evidence or a meeting just to help us carry out that assessment or help the third-party body who will come in and carry that out for us. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Simon. Any other questions on this report? No? So item 11 is Richard again, Internal Audit Plan 21-22, Quarter 2.
Thank you very much, Chair. I mean, we've already, certainly Simon has spoken in the last report about the way we've changed our approach to internal audit. So in the past, those members that have been on the committee before and rejoined will have been subjected to me doing an annual audit plan report to them, where I say this is what we're going to do over the next 12 months. And then throughout the progress report, have to update committee on the fact that we couldn't do this, we couldn't do that, this changed, that changed. The idea now is that we have an indicative plan, so we'll have a plan ready for the next quarter. So this is the Quarter 2 plan coming here with our ideas of what we think we'll be looking at there. Again, there's still things that can change within that, and we're tending to have a lot more contingencies now. We're also doing a lot more consultancy work alongside the assurance work. And you can still get assurance from that consultancy work, because you're still, in certain cases where we're looking at how processes are happening, how people are dealing with various risks and what controls they're putting in place, we can still get assurance from what they're doing as to, that can then feed into the annual audit opinion. But we're looking now at a rolling plan. So you'll see in the report that there are suggestions going forward for Quarter 3, 4 and then Quarter 1 of the following year. So what we're looking at now is that each quarter it just moves on. There will be examples. In an ideal world, I'd like to say we'll get every audit done within the quarter it's supposed to be, but it doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't happen like that. So there is some roll on between quarters. But where possible, we've identified those audits in there that are, say, quarters 1 to 4, and we've got those stipulated in the plan. So it's basically looking at what we think now are the key areas to look at. And the concentration this year has been based around our use of the risk register and also the Council's recovery plan. So we're looking at areas to provide committee with assurances that the recovery plan and all the different items in that is being, it's being run properly. So that's our main focus of this. I'm not going to go into the plan in great detail, but it's there in Appendix 1. Certain key areas that we look at all the time, but other new areas coming in that we want to look at, like the Better Together approach. Again, that will be more of a consultancy style thing at first, but we may do specific work around that. But again, it's how far formed is that? We don't want to go in too early, then again we don't want to go in too late, and that the idea at the moment, as Simon was saying with the embedded assurances, audit works alongside the managers now, and we can see the various stages. We're certainly doing that with the Sinfin Waste Plant. We have monthly meetings with the key officer, and one of my auditors is attending meetings there so they can see at each stage how things are progressing. And so that's our way forward. And as Simon mentioned as well, business partnering. The two group auditors are going to be business partnering with directorates. So one will be business partnering with people services, one with communities in place, and I partner with corporate resources. And hopefully, and this picks up on what Councillor Kerr was saying as well about audit staff understanding the committee needs, to future meetings of the committee, certainly where we've got progress reports coming, I'll be bringing the two group auditors with me to those meetings because they have a much more in-depth knowledge of the individual audits there, and plus it also gets them to interact with committee as well and understand where committee are coming from on these type of things.
Thanks, Richard. Do any committee members have questions, or are there any items that members want assurance on that aren't featured? Councillor Kerr.
Can I thank you, Richard, for expanding what you have in 4.3 in terms of what you have done in terms of putting the thing together and actually mentioning the recovery plan, because the recovery plan is clearly a key element in the plan, but it wasn't there in your introductory narrative. The other thing, just in terms of some of these, they look very woolly. And I think there's going to be a real challenge to work out what an auditor is actually going to look at when you're looking at something which has so little form at the moment. I just wondered if you could comment any more on that.
Yes, the aim will be to get the auditor involved in that audit, to sit down with the managers and discuss where they're going with various things. Those audits the good old traditional audits weren't a problem because you could scope them beforehand, go in there and deliver that scope of audit. Now we need to do a lot more fact-finding around what's happening with these type of things. And the key issue really is to say, well, what are the risks? So what's your objective from this piece of work that you're doing? So what are the risks to stop you hitting those objectives? And that's what the auditors should start focusing on, those risks and what mitigating actions they've got in place. So that's how we will be focusing our audits. Simon,
Did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think just maybe to highlight to members, the format of this table has changed, and we've often just had a title of something and everyone's interpreted it what they think it is going to cover. And you'll see that last column, assurance reasons for audit, trying to give a bit more definition to that. Richard and his team are also redesigning and relaunching the audit planning records. So when we start an audit, it's very clear what risks we're trying to consider and the scope of the audit. Because I think, if I got to be absolutely honest, some of the audits in the past, especially where there's been delays, is that someone thinks they're having an audit on something. The auditor does an audit, produces a report, people say, I don't like that because I don't think that is what the scope was, and then it create a delay in signing it off. And so I think this is a start, and I think if you look at that last column, I think that's a major improvement, that as a member you can see, of this committee, you can see what we think the risk is that we want to be testing. So, for example, on SINFIN, for example, it talks about looking in this one in terms of the stage boundaries and key decision points of a project, which I think most of us would say we know that with the sort of current SINFIN plan, there's various stages which are happening, and you want assurance that the right information is being used at the right stage to move or not to move onto the next stage. So, overall, I think it's definitely on the right direction. If any member wants detail on any particular audit or want to share with Richard their observation of their experience in a particular area being looked at, I think the voice of a customer, and by implication the voice of a member, is quite important. And we did say we wanted this committee to be governance, where some of those pulse concerns, if you want to call it, whether it be from an inspector, from your ward work, could feed into this committee. But in the meantime, of course, feed them into Richard as they come along, so we can use your intelligence, your knowledge and your reach to sort of improve our auditing. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Simon. I do think, I see where you're coming from, Councillor Kerr, with the sort of lack of detail in some of these assurance and reasons, but I do think, and I did comment to Richard, that I love the layout of this form, and I think Councillor Hussain, this was one that you highlighted when you were last on the committee, that it wasn't particularly clear, and the changes that they've made, I think, make it very clear what they're setting out to do. Councillor Willoughby.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I was just listening into some of those conversations on this and the last item, and certainly within the sort of industry that I work in, as an audit, I do audits myself, we tend to have sort of, to do engineering type activities, sort of engineering specialists, as auditor doing the audits, so bearing in mind about using specialists. Although there is a sort of general, I have to sort of caution that and say that there are some techniques to doing auditing, so it is important to go through some sort of training before you carry out and do audits and that sort of thing. And so I think that's important, because I, for instance, my specialist subject, if you like, I can go off and do audits of software development processes. I can probably do that just sat here now. But I've also done more general engineering, because there is some things you can read across, and as long as you know the standard you're following, it helps, and you've got those skills of asking questions and probing a bit deeper, and and asking for the evidence as well. And then on this plan, I think, you know, the way that this is good, because this is the way sort of, at least my industry, you know, my particular bit is going. We're doing this more sort of interactive thing, looking at, particularly talking to process owners or owners of the process, which is his managers here, about what, you know, what particular focus the audit should be and what particular concerns there are. So I think, you know, from my knowledge of the sort of general sort of more quality, if you like, quality sort of procedural type auditing world, is certainly following the pattern that that's following, and it is sort of encouraging, and, you know, the auditors can go in and, you know, to sort of do a more detailed scope up of the audit as well, Chair. So I just thought I'd add that sort of, you know, just to sort of encourage them with the way that they're going, and I think it looks good.
Thanks, Councillor Willoughby. Any other comments on this? No? Then recommendation is to consider and approve. So I take it we are all approving Q2's plan? Yes? I have nods. Super. Carry on the good work, Richard. That brings us to the end of the meeting. So thank you very much for your attendance. The next meeting is the 28th of July, and as I've said, we will look to schedule